In my last queer history video, which you can link to up there, I briefly mention a bookstore that opened at this location in 1983. And that video received a wave of positive comments about the bookstore and one or two disparaging comments that wanted to bash it on the basis of a misconception, which I'd like to address. I tell the full story of Little Sister's Book and Art Emporium on the Really Gay History Tour, and I plan on telling it in even more detail in my upcoming book on local queer history. And if you want to know more about that, you should subscribe and follow this channel, because I'll have more to say about it in the future. But for today, let's put aside the story of the legal struggle and the landmark litigation and the appeals and the verdict and the Supreme Court victory, and let's even put aside the human story of the heroes who were on the front lines, so that we can zero in on one very narrow aspect of this story. What were they selling? What was being seized? And was Little Sisters basically just an adult sex shop fighting for their right to sell a bunch of smutty magazines? Well, they were selling their fair share of adult-oriented material. But before you go running straight into the comments feeling vindicated so that you can shout out your support for Customs Canada, let's pause for a minute and have a closer look. Because if you were around in the 80s or 90s, you will probably remember that every single Shell station and 7-Eleven had rows upon rows of Penthouse and Playboy. I remember the Playgirls. Playboy and Hustler and whatever else just sitting there on the top racks, and none of that had any trouble getting over the border. The gay stuff, which was not as widely available, was barely a drop in that ocean. So let's be real. Customs was not engaged in any sort of serious fight against obscenity in Canada. They were just picking on a particular bookstore that catered to a queer clientele. It was a discriminatory policing of dirty magazines, and it was important that Little Sisters push back on that. Because a queer bookstore that is fighting for their freedom of expression is one that is fighting for your freedom of expression. And their victory at the Supreme Court enshrines in the law better protections for all Canadians. But it wasn't just the principle that was at stake. I think that the dirty magazines mattered on their own terms. Let's go to the new location. At a time when we did not have critically acclaimed popular gay hockey romances streaming directly into our homes, or any other examples of queerness in the movies or in our music or anywhere, where exactly were we supposed to go if we wanted to see ourselves reflected in the real world? This was a society that had pushed queer representation all the way to the outermost edges of the culture, and then condemned us for going to the fringes to try and get it. We should not be surprised that queer people were flocking towards any sort of self-reflection that they could get. And adult-only material was pretty much the only place that any sort of queer expression was even allowed. And even that, the government wanted to take from us. But it wasn't just the queer representation that mattered. The fact that it was erotic imagery also mattered, in my opinion. We are talking about people who have been denigrated and shamed and ostracized on the basis of their sexual desires. For queer people, sexual imagery can mean something quite different than it might mean for people whose desires are more accepted. For queer people, imagery like that can be normalizing and validating and even healing. It documented the existence of queer sexuality in the real world, and it documented the existence of queer joy and queer pleasure at a time when our community was faced with so much misery and pain. At the height of the AIDS crisis, those dirty magazines weren't just displaying queer sexuality, they were talking about it in open and candid ways, describing how to stay safe. And the fact that the government was blocking information like that from coming across the border means that during the crisis, they were worse than useless. They were obstructive. They were tragically inept when it came to helping us, but surprisingly competent when it came to hindering us. Those dirty magazines were lifesavers, and Little Sisters was fighting for our lives. But it wasn't just the magazines that Customs was after. The Joy of Gay Sex, for example, is not a porno mag, it is a book. It is a how-to manual with drawings for instructional purposes, not photographs for entertainment purposes. Its heterosexual counterpart was available everywhere, but The Joy of Gay Sex was seized at the border by Customs. Maybe you think a book like that is sort of porno adjacent, but it was not the only book being seized. Books of art were being seized with images of queer sexuality, including art books that had photographs of ancient Greek sculpture and pottery. Even academic works that had similar homoerotic imagery on its pages were being seized. Descriptive text could be deemed obscene if describing queer sexuality, and it turns out that the descriptions didn't even have to be that explicit. The Young in One Another's Arms is a work of fiction by a Canadian author set here in Vancouver with no explicit descriptions of sexuality. But it does have queer characters engaged in sexual relationships. And for that, I guess Customs thought that was enough, and they seized the book. Even the works of literary giants like Oscar Wilde were seized at the border. Who did Customs think they were? Little Sisters may have been selling magazines, but it was first and foremost a bookstore with shelves full of literature and poetry and fiction and nonfiction. There were books on coming out, and there were people's memoirs, and there were books that would help you reconcile your sexuality with your faith, books that might help you understand yourself in the light of history or the latest psychology, and every single title was at risk, whether or not Customs was targeting that title, because these repeated seizures at the border amounted to a sustained attack against the bookstore itself, threatening to put it out of business, which would have resulted in stopping the flow of queer literature of all kinds across the border into our community. And it wasn't just the books, it was the bookstore itself. Little Sisters was a place that you could just walk into off the street and say help, and someone would be there to guide you to the exact book that you needed for wherever you were at in your journey. It was, as much as anything else, a community resource center, and it was even more than that. Those books reflected back to us a version of ourselves that we had never been allowed to see before as complex, nuanced beings. And the bookstore reflected that version of our community to the wider world. You could no longer say that we were just a bunch of perverts hooking up in gay bars, because now we had a bookstore visibly taking up space on Davie Street. And it demonstrated that we were literate and intelligent people, educated, with substance, that we had a culture and a history. It legitimized us. So no, it wasn't just a bunch of porno. It was a place that really mattered. It was the cornerstone of our emerging village on Davie Street. And it was books that gave us knowledge and empowerment. And it was gloriously erotic imagery that showed us as sexually free and liberated beings. All of that is what Little Sisters was fighting for, and their victory was significant. But the fight itself is still not over. Queer literature and representation and knowledge are still under attack in Canada. And that is why the Really Gay History Tour is partnering with Vancouver's Trans, Two-Spirit, and Queer Community Center, Community. In 2026 and beyond, a portion of each ticket sold for the walking tour will go to support essential services and programs at Community as they move into their new facility. There are links below if you want to book a spot on the walking tour or donate to Community directly. And if you want to bring queer history like this to your company or next event, you can reach out to me directly. Thanks for joining me. Stay gay, keep it queer, and I'll see you in the next video.